Good afternoon, everybody. This is Aneesh. Thank you all for dialing in. This is going to be an interesting conversation. I am snowed in, as all of us in DC seem to be. So, any number of the following things may happen during the course of this. One, my kids may come running in and screaming, which is great because no school today. And two, I hope my Wi-Fi stays working so you'll have access to the content. And with those caveats, I think here's how we're going to run this. I am going to do my best to characterize the big takeaways from the ONC/CMS rules. I will do so with an eye more towards the ideas that I would hope many of you might take from this, but also with an eye towards the areas that I intend to be more actively engaged. We have a number of folks across the membership on the call today, from plans to ACOs/health systems to broader industry stakeholders. And we have some guests as well joining. Near the end of my formal remarks, I'm going to want to get your feedback on, first of all, questions that you'll have about any of what I've surmised from all of this. But also areas that you would like personally to get involved in, so I can make sure you're plugged into the various industry activities that are underway, and suggestions on how I can be helpful to you. And then finally, where appropriate, if we can have group discussion or maybe group chat, we'll follow up if there are folks who want to be working on some initiatives together that we might help facilitate. So let me begin by just stating glee. This has been an exciting week. The ONC/CMS rules I would characterize as aggressive, but very promising. That is to say, they are asking a lot of the industry, but setting a kind of a foundation for what we're going to need to be successful as we move the care delivery system more towards a value orientation. So here's the quick run of show, if you will. I'm going to cover the summary of the 5 key takeaways from my perspective. I'm going to do that now. And then we're going to then from that dive into each of them with respect to implications for the industry. I'm going to start out by making sort of a political statement, which is that I view both the ONC and the CMS rules as effectively bipartisan regulation. You'll hear some language in my attempt to describe the implications that may feel somewhat more political, but I do believe they generally reflect progress that had been built. I just note, for purposes of the screenshot here, that during our tenure in the Obama administration, we had put forward a vision for modernizing the economy more generally in the form of a strategy for American innovation. The White House has built on that foundation. They have an Office of American Innovation. A number of the key initiatives that they've launched from that office draw very naturally from the work that had started. Quoting the Trump administration, not our Obama team, they view this as a generational consensus to modernize the government and to embrace all the power and potential that technology, data, and innovation might offer to help us meet the big challenges in the labor market and healthcare and a variety of other areas. So it is in that spirit that you're going to hear me talk about the rules. These are my 5 key takeaways, and we're going to spend some time on each. The first takeaway is that consumer-directed exchange, the idea that the consumer has the control over the connection from a hospital, a health plan, a lab, or other HIPAA-covered entity, that they can control the transfer of that information to an application they trust. That appears to have become the preferred interoperability method. Let me take a moment just to, as I go through each of these 5, you're going to see a slide on each, but I just want to characterize preferred. There are some specific provisions in the rule that seem to favor the consumer-directed exchange method above other methods of interoperability. The second principle, and this was where I got a little bit spicy in my language, and so you'll bear with me, but I view the information blocking rule as akin to net neutrality for healthcare data. And more specifically, we're going to describe what that means in the context of how stakeholders in the more traditional B2B space can operate by building upon the API standards that are first meant for purposes of the consumer-directed exchange. Third, there are a couple of spicier, and these are going to be subject to heavy debate and discussion over the course of the rule comment period. But spicy element number one is that for health plans, there's a new set of obligations around care coordination, what you'll hear me describe as sort of the one-click U.S. core data elements for interoperability, the U.S. CDI. Health plans have not historically been subject to interoperability regulation with respect to publishing data. This pushes it pretty hard, and in some cases might be viewed as some are going to clearly to be maybe an area of pushback, I guess will be the area. There'll be comments about how far do plans have to go in making available the data that they've been acquiring in managing the patient's care. The second area of sensitivity, obviously, is the notion that hospitals, as a condition of participation, are going to have to make available discharge notifications. This has been something many of us, those of you on the line who might be familiar, a lot of us have been kind of advocating for this. So while I'm providing commentary on the rule, I'm also explaining and acknowledging that I've been pushing for some of these provisions. So don't throw virtual tomatoes at me if you're not finding these to be particularly helpful to your organization, but know that I have been on the side of encouraging all of these. There's going to be a new term that will emerge from some of this work, and that term, coined in part by the HL7 standards community, is the idea of a fire accelerator. And standards development take time. It takes, in some cases, many, many years for an idea to become a standard, to be recognized as a standard. There's clearly a lot of pressure to move faster on standards development, especially as we've moved to sort of internet-based data exchange. And so you'll hear a lot about the notion of an accelerator construct to encourage the industry to move faster and to adopt sooner and to provide feedback in a more agile fashion. So these are the 5 key takeaways that I want to spend the rest of our time, or at least my presentation part of the time together. And then obviously we'll turn it up for conversation. I think mechanically, you have the opportunity to unmute yourself. And so you're welcome to sort of post a little tweet, if you will, or a text, if you will, on the group chat. You're welcome to send me notes there, and or hit unmute during the course of this, or maybe wait until I'm done, whatever makes sense. So long story short, it is pretty exciting. All right, let's go through each of the 5, and then we'll have time for discussion. A consumer-directed exchange, what does it mean to have this be the preferred channel for interoperability? Well, a couple things. One, we've had a bit of a milestone in the consumer-directed exchange movement. Up until probably a few months ago, the only sources of data that were making information available to an app of a consumer's choice were those who were under some legal or regulatory obligation to do so. And the Meaningful Use Program in 2015 called for a functional application programming interface. So doctors and hospitals would have to support what now is really doubled down upon in the interop rules. But up until now, this has been something that's been really a compliance mindset. So you could take a look, for example, Epic, to its credit, made the voluntary decision to disclose every hospital or health system that is live on the Meaningful Use 2020 edition. And that list is a wonderful place to go to get a sense for where people are. But that list represents organizations that ultimately have to make this available. Currently, they have to make it available by October 1 of 2019 if you're going by the letter of the regulation, that is the 90-day reporting period this calendar year. So there's a lot of compliance activity, and we're catching up to the organizations between now and October 1 who are making that FHIR endpoint available. But about maybe 2 months ago or so, Apple announced something quite interesting. Apple was able to add LabCorp and Quest as suppliers to their Apple Health program. Now, for those of you who've heard me talk about this before, I'll reiterate again now. Apple has made the business decision that it will only connect to FHIR servers that are compliant or conformant with the FHIR API standard as constrained by the Argonaut Project Implementation Guide. For those of you who are new to that language, that's a mouthful, but the good news is it's sort of akin to a USB drive that you can have confidence you can plug something into and it's going to respond in a consistent manner. In this case, Apple Health wanted to minimize, presumably, I don't speak for them obviously, but I presume they were trying to minimize the burden that if they were to connect to a particular EHR endpoint, that they didn't want to have to bear a huge burden of manipulating the data after they moved it off of the EHR system and into Apple in order to make it useful for patients. By establishing this sort of FHIR conformance testing program, they were in a better position to basically take as is the content. So if the Apple Health app says get medications, then you would know the EHR vendor who's conformant with the standard would be responding back with medications in a list codified using the RX norm data standard. So the fact that we're moving from kind of compliance only consumer directed exchange to now an opportunity for voluntary participation, that does create some very interesting dynamics. The culture change here is pretty clear. I would say the graphic on the bottom of the slide just speaks to the problem. I think Farzad may be on the call, who's a fellow compatriot and a brother in the cause. During his tenure as ONC director, and even in Don Rucker's current tenure, ONC reports the key statistics in the Meaningful Use program. And I think in 2017 is when I got this last chart. While 93% of hospitals were reporting that they had the technical ability to electronically distribute health information, or more specifically discharge instructions, a rule, by the way, we put in place in 2010, one of the first rules, if you will, for Meaningful Use. Everybody can effectively meet that rule. But, and this is the frustration of sort of a compliance mindset, when we got into the nitty gritty of defining the metric, I think the rule was something akin to 50% of all requests for discharge instructions had to be met within 3 business days. The purpose of that metric was to sort of say this is not a 30-day HIPAA clock, which is what we have today, but rather trying to push faster by saying you can do this in 3 days. And the premise was that we would focus more on the 3-day versus 30-day, not the numerator denominator. It turned out the debate was what was in the denominator. Is the denominator every patient who discharged, or is it a patient who requested it? And I will tell you, in a massive amount of frustration, the majority of hospitals reported under penalty of perjury that not a single patient requested an electronic copy of their discharge instructions. So there is a huge cultural shift here about whether we inform patients and their caregivers or we don't about their rights, and that just it remains frustrating, but it is what it is. So this move from only the compliance-oriented organizations are here versus, the new crop of people that will voluntarily contribute. That is very exciting. And I hope it's the beginning of a trend where it'll be sort of consumer first, interoperability, and then we'll work out all the business-to-business arrangements. By the way, and I'll get into this momentarily, there's also a financial preference in the rule. It suggests that there's no fees to be charged to consumers or their apps. There's a lot of commentary on fees, which I'll get to in a moment, but that this is a very exciting proposition, in that the consumer approach is one that will be the most cost effective, at least for the people who are trying to help patients make the best use of that data. By the way, that could be a physician's office, it could be a health system, it could be a health plan, it could be a retailer, it could be anybody who's motivated. By the way, I took the screenshot on purpose of the Quest and the LabCorp, only to point out, as a Virginian, and I spent a lot of time in state government, that it was not the mega health systems in Virginia, Inova, Centera, UVA, Carillion, all of whom are on Epic, all of whom had access to the Epic software that could have enabled them to go live. But the first Virginia institution to go live on Apple was actually a physician group, orthopedics group called Ortho Virginia. So the folks who think that you have to have massive amounts of capital and you've got to have some PhD in interoperability physics team on your staff to do this, nope, a good old physician group was able to do it with, quote unquote, no special effort. Okay. So what does that mean? Idea number one, we're going to have 5 of these. Idea number one, I do believe that the implications here are that if you are interested in accessing patient data, providing patients a service to help them make sense of that data, that you are, this encourages you to build some type of FHIR client to help patients organize that information. And I know Shafiq may be on the line. The team at Rush, I just have great fondness for Shafiq and what he's been able to do as an early adopter.
Yes, brother, I'm on the line.
Okay, thank you, Shafiq. So you can see Rush was among the first, if not the first, health system to make it through the CMS Blue Button app development program, and
we also did the prior auth.
And you're doing prior auth. I know we're gonna get to all the use cases. But this is an example of having a strategy, a purposeful strategy to go consumer-directed exchange first. Humana is also live. Humana, with maybe a few, 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, 10 days, whatever it was, before the end of open enrollment. That would have been just a couple months ago. They quietly turned on, and I say quietly, it was obviously press released, but it wasn't heavily marketed. The functionality that said, if you were shopping for a Part D plan and you wanted to estimate your drug costs, in the old days, you would click an icon like estimate your drug costs, for example, on mymedicare.gov, and you'd have to manually enter all your historical drugs. And I remember talking to one of the websites that does sort of a shopping portal experience, and they said, Aneesh, the #1 button that's pushed on that page is skip this step. And so I understand there's sort of friction there. And so Humana offered the ability for patients to authorize the blue button feed, and upon approval to have that information feed the calculator so that they could prioritize the plans that are right for you. By the way, in less than 10 days, they had thousands of people voluntarily push the blue button. And so the notion that patients don't want it or wouldn't understand it, that paternalistic view, as organizations, break through the barrier internally about whether this is even remotely possible, you might come out on the other end with the same level of confidence that, my goodness, this feels like the right path. Okay, so this is where I was getting a little bit more controversial on the issue of the API fees. For those of you who follow Twitter, Arian Malik, among others, have done phenomenal tweet storms on, what are the implications of the fee provisions and the information blocking rule. From purposes of this discussion, I want to describe it mostly in the context of net neutrality. If you look on the left of this picture, you can sort of see the Obama era net neutrality rule had some basic principles. The basic principles were that if you were the internet service provider and you were in that monopoly position because you were the set-top box in the consumer's home, that you couldn't preference services that otherwise would be competitively available to consumers just because you happen to own that pipe and they pay you for that service. So you can't block access to services, especially if they compete with services that you offer. You can't treat them differentially. You can't say, well, the Comcast version of Netflix is going to get faster response time than the Netflix version of Netflix. And so frustrating people to the point where they have to accept a lesser quality set-top box video service only because it's been preferenced by their technology service provider. And there's not going to be this sort of like pay-to-play model where people that have, hookups on the back end to say, hey, sponsor my stuff and it'll get through faster. Somehow that'll be different than the startup on the street that might offer a better service but didn't have the capital to pay to access the pipes. That philosophy is the key message that I gathered from the information blocking rule. I was sensitive to call it net neutrality because I don't want them to get scared and turn it all off. So hopefully this language won't be seen as like, what? We have to oppose it because that's something bad. I don't know, but I do think it is the right way of characterizing it. As I noted on the previous slide, and this is a screenshot from the ONC's website. They've posted all their slide decks from HIMSS, which is wonderful. And the logic of this is that the patient's apps don't get charged. And if you are in the B2B context providing services, you're basically going to recoup the costs of the utility feature, which is that API functionality. And this provision is the one that made me most excited because many health systems on the line here feel like, well, I've got an EHR vendor. Obviously, the EHR vendor is going to manage my API, and I have to sort of do whatever they say is the process. Well, this is a direct quote from ONC. An API technology supplier must grant an API data provider the sole authority and autonomy to permit API users to interact with the API technology deployed by the API data provider. In other words, you can configure your own control panel. Now, whether the control panel is provided by your EHR vendor or you find another friend in the cause, another provider of that service, the goal here is to, the suggestion here, I should say, is that you as the purchaser of the EHR technology should have the control to manage that gateway. That'll be an interesting sort of dimension here, which is a race to a fully configurable API gateway at every endpoint. That to me is what I believe every health system CIO should be pursuing. And as we get to the health plan implications for how they configure these technologies. And again, Shafiq's on the line. If we get into questions, Shafiq, you might be tapped into it. That's exactly how Shafiq functions on his API gateway. He's able to do a lot more faster than the average EHR customer because he has control over his gateway. He doesn't freewheel and go outside of standards. He's just able to adopt standards earlier and to demonstrate that they work in the field. So the implication here is that the industry as a whole, this is a general statement about an idea for the industry, to focus more on value-added services and less on whether people are paying you to buy data. I hate that term because it just feels awful, but when you look at all of the risk scores and all the various applications that consume data for whatever purpose, there's a heavy premium on, hey, can I get the records? And then once I get the records, then I can do wonderful things with the records. I think the suggestion here is the price of access should fall, and the the focus on value-added services should be the basis of competition. Medicare itself launched a mobile app called eMedicare, and I thought for fun, just to kind of describe what a value add looks like versus access. So I just picked it, for purposes of this discussion, pick and choose. What are the, I picked 3 examples of things that are in the eMedicare app that might benefit from a value-added service. So on transitional care management services, Medicare notes if you're a loved one caring for a mom, my mom and dad are both on Medicare. Hey, if they're leaving the hospital and they're coming home, depending on how sick they are, they may be eligible for an in-person visit with their physician within 2 weeks of their return home. So you might learn on the eMedicare mobile app that that's a benefit you're entitled to, which translates into time with your doctor to sit down and discuss the discharge instructions, to maybe review the box of meds you have at home with the box of meds you have upon discharge. And that's wonderful, but I don't know how often, mom and dad are going to be looking up the eMedicare.gov mobile app when they're leaving the hospital coming home. It may be a wonderful opportunity for a value-added service where someone says, hey, I'm going to get access to that discharge feed, and maybe I'll help the patient by getting access to their doctor's scheduling feed. And maybe I can say to them, by the way, you are leaving the hospital, you are going home. We think based on your condition, you may be eligible. Ask your doctor about a care transition visit. And so you might start to see that kind of prompt in the way we deliver care. Or Medicare offers an annual wellness visit, and many health systems are promoting these as a service, an opportunity to develop a personalized prevention plan. Back to my point about content and compliance versus voluntary participation. Today there isn't really a kind of an interoperability standard to pull that care prevention plan. So you might visit your primary care doctor. You might get a care plan written on your behalf. You may not be able to have a copy of that plan in some computable form on your phone or with other app that you trust. And so to the extent that we can accelerate the development of the interactive care plan data standards, then perhaps not only do you envision a future where you could get the copy of the plan, but you might actually have the opportunity to note that you've been adherent with the plan or you have questions about the plan, and that may be another basis of conversation. And then last but not least, the diabetes prevention program is now live as a covered benefit nationwide. If you went to the eMedicare app, it would tell you that you're qualified for this, whatever it is, 16 course program free of charge, but you have to have your A1C levels between these values. You've got to have some other factors. So the ability for an app to access your clinical data, is another piece here. So let's see what just happened. I'm assuming something is fishy on my Zoom. Can you all still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Can you still see the slides?
We still see idea number 2.
Oh, good. Okay. So it's only my own computer that seems to have figured out here. Okay. All right. So if we go to the next, if you can still see this is the next provision of the rule that has caused some trouble is the.
Okay, I was incorrect, but I will not.
Can you still see me? Yes. Good. Okay. So the next provision, now we're getting into the sort of spicier stuff. For health plans, there's an obligation for health plans to make a blue button-like service available to patients. That isn't that controversial. We've been expecting a rule like this. And Amol, I think you may be on from Cambia, and I thank you, and I've thanked you before for your leadership. But we now have sort of an industry consensus on how to achieve the CMS blue button feature within a health plan context. And not everybody's going to use that standard, but we are hopeful that we'll get industry consensus and we'll go from there. But the controversial provision, and this is my interpretation, again, you all have lawyers and they'll be subject to their own opinions, but there's a section in the rule that suggests that health plans who collect clinical data, lab values, notes, and other information, whether it be for star ratings or risk adjustment or for whatever purpose, as they begin collecting clinical information about the patient. If the patient were to leave the plan for a competitor plan, that the content that the health plan had acquired over the course of that member year would be freely available to the patient's next plan. This is the notion is that anything that's mapped to the U.S. core data for interoperability, that content mix, and this is a screenshot again from ONC about what are the elements in that content. This is beyond claims data. This is claims plus any clinical data that has been accepted or acquired, I should say, by the health plans. Now, the reason I mentioned that this is a bit spicy is that today, I believe health plans incur a pretty sizable expense acquiring a lot of this information. And to the extent that they make that investment, and then at the time of open enrollment, a competitor plan convinces the patient to switch, all of that investment will carry forward. And so to me, this is really exciting because it will improve overall healthcare for patients. It puts a pretty big burden on the plans, but it will result in some conversation about what how does a health plan reconcile the investments made to acquire the data with the ease with which that information will transfer to a potential competitor. My suggestion here, I almost thought of titling this MacGyvering Your Way to Clinical and Claims Data combination. But in a way, my bias is to run cloud first on a whole range of these subjects. So the logic here is, if you are if you are in a position to assemble this information and your costs are X, if you embrace the cloud, could you bring the cost down by 90%? That's sort of the aspirational statement here. So the burden of and the fear of fighting off the need to share that information to the next plan, that might fall if your costs to acquire member data and to bring that clinical and claims data organized in a manner that helps to identify gaps in care and to better coordinate for care management services. That idea of let's MacGyver our way, let's embrace modern tools. How can we bring down the costs of collecting and organizing all of that data? And my recommendation is the announcement from August of last year when Google, Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, Salesforce, Oracle all stood in unison and said we were going to embrace sort of FHIR APIs into our infrastructure, that I believe this is the opportunity to embrace the use of cloud services to help acquire, organize, and then package up in a US CDI compliant format all of that relevant information. I will say I find it humorous, having worked with a bunch of health plans in our membership, that you don't even have a US CDI compliant version of your patient's data internally, let alone prepare it for purposes of care transition. Because Department A has risk adjustment stuff, and Department B has star rating stuff, and Department C has care coordination content, and even internally, I would find that it's a rare occurrence that all of that's been organized in one clean patient profile. And so the irony of the rule about making it available on transition might actually encourage cloud adoption and use for internal operability as opposed to care coordination interoperability. Okay, carrying on this theme and to build on the spirit of controversy, now on the hospital side, hospitals have to publish ADT feeds to physicians who can account for their relationships with patients. And CMS not only has put their thumb on the scale in saying that this is a requirement, they've attached it to the conditions of participation, which mean failure to meet this requirement could jeopardize your ability to see Medicare patients as a whole. No surprise that the American Hospital Association came out, minutes after the rule was published, it seemed, in fierce opposition to this. I find that to be a bit short-sighted. I do think that we are entering an era where this information needs to be made available for all the clinical reasons. At the point of transition, it's when we have some of the most important areas of engagement for reducing the need for readmissions and ensuring that there's a safe transition to the home. So for clinical reasons, this isn't obvious. Obviously, there are business implications. In concert with the rule, and I'll get into this in a moment, and I'm taking longer than I wanted to for this, so forgive me. I'm gonna go a little bit faster. But the premise was that CMS wrote a letter to the HL7 standards community, explicitly calling for a number of areas of improvement that need to be done in order to embrace sort of FHIR APIs as a way to meet these obligations. And right at the very top of the letter, this is a screenshot of the letter, all publicly available, and I think I've got the URL below, blog.hl7.org, where you can see the letter in its full variety, ADT feeds, and the idea today, we have very mature standards for ADT feeds, and Farzad will yell at me for saying that we need to do anything else here, and I appreciate and respect that we have a mature standard in the field. Hospitals can turn on an HL7 v2 message. However, I do believe if we embrace a FHIR format, and more specifically the notion of FHIR encounter resource, which can be pushed not only to patients but to physicians, that may allow us to conform or comply with this rule without having to feel as if there'll be some taxi medallion like economic impact where you have to write a check to somebody to do work in order to be compliant, and that burden, unfunded burden, may be something that hospitals might point to for justifying opposition. To me, adding the FHIR encounter resource as a real-time method of distribution of discharge information is something that could be added to the FHIR gateways, and with modest effort could be configured to make it available for physicians who can account for a roster of patients that they're responsible for, or to individual patient designated apps. Well, that leads to my fourth point, which is this is one of the best moments of the opening keynote at HIMSS, which I had really a big pleasure and an honor of joining with SEMA, Governor Levitt, and with Karen DeSalvo, was the moment when Governor Levitt made the statement that CMS is leading the private sector in embracing these innovative methods of data sharing. And to give you all a window into what's going on here, CMS simultaneously announced not only rules, not only a letter to HL7, but since that wasn't enough, that they would actually begin delivering bulk access to claims data via FHIR APIs. This is an idea that's only been a year or so in the making. ONC, Dr. Don Rucker, had been challenging the standards community to look at population level FHIR API use cases. ONC has funded a trial project between Tufts Health Plan and Children's Hospital of Boston, where they're now actively developing the capacity to say, here's the roster of patients. Can you go find their content and give me an API token so I can query their records, daily or weekly or whatever? And CMS announced that it's going to offer the exact same capability called the Beneficiary Claims Data API. And I'm assuming for those of you on the line who are CareJourney members, you've already been, many of you have already volunteered, sent an email to CMS saying you want to be early adopters. I hope others of you will follow suit. They are now open for business, so to speak, and welcoming early adopters. It feels very similar to what happened with Blue Button, where CMS announced it was open for business at last year's HIMSS and formally hit go on the service in August. So there may be a similar time frame here worth thinking about. All right, so now the fifth principle here is that we're going to see a lot more data coming through the FHIR pipe. I did an analogy of a Roku set-top box. I don't know if it worked quite well, but I'll try it again briefly. What's happened in the Meaningful Use 2015 edition is that doctors and hospitals are upgrading to software that looks like a Roku set-top box at each and every one of their EHRs. And that Roku set-top box is available for consumers to access through an app of their choice. And the joke I made, which I think continues to get a bit of a chuckle, and so I'll repeat it, is that when that consumer on that mobile app logs into the Roku at Dr. Smith's practice, the only channel available for the patient to subscribe to is the common clinical data set, which was characterized on the left in the current version of it. And I referred to that as PBS without Downton Abbey, meaning it may not be all of the information necessary to help manage that patient's care. And I did note, and Farzad, if you're still on, I look back at our interim final rule. It was January of 2010 when we published the initial spec of what is now called the Common Clinical Data Set. And I pointed out that in the 9+ years since this thing has been up and running, 9 years, the industry has not added a single additional bit of content, no new channels added, but the minimum required to meet compliance. And so we don't have a common cancer data set. We don't have a consistent standardized method of delivering open notes or medical images or interactive care plans or that discharge notification or, as CMS called for, a form of net pricing calculator. And so to the extent that we have this problem, I do believe and this gets to the last, and final point around this, is that not only by the way, given that Roku channel, I did want to say this is the summary of the letter that HL7 published, which is, CMS wrote to HL7 that said, we need ATT feeds, we need a standardized method of accessing claims data, we need real-time benefit check for pricing data on drugs at the point of prescribing. We need access to provider directories so patients know who's in network and out of network, whether they're accepting new patients or not. Standards for bulk data access, which we just talked about, which could help with the ADT feed issue. Pricing data more generally. So not just prescription drug pricing, but pricing for procedures. Quality information, and then finally, what you would characterize as the rest of the designated record set. All right, so now that leads me to the final recommendation, and really the one that's going to be a work in progress in the weeks ahead, and that is my suggestion that everybody on this call participate in a FHIR accelerator. What's a FHIR accelerator? When Seema Verma wrote the letter to HL7, HL7 responded by saying, wow, you've asked for a lot of content be created in a standardized format. We have to better organize ourselves to accelerate the pace of change. So that led to the FHIR Accelerator Program. In that FHIR Accelerator Program, the idea is that HL7 will work with communities of interest who wish to voluntarily test, adopt, and then share feedback on draft FHIR specifications. The FHIR Accelerator Program begins with 3 existing accelerators. I'm involved in 2. The Argonaut Project represents a great deal of consensus making within the EHR community. The Karen Alliance focuses on all data to consumers. And so we're focusing now on health plan data to consumers and real-time benefit check for consumers, since those are gaps not covered by the Argonaut Project. And then the Da Vinci Initiative with a number of health plans and providers really focusing on the more business-to-business oriented use cases, prior auth, and the like. A word on each of these, and I'll make sure we make the slides available afterwards so you can kind of get the detail. For those of you who are curious, I'm going to give you a few sentences on each of these 3 standards accelerators. Argonaut this year. The Argonaut Steering Committee did approve focusing on upgrading to the latest version of FHIR. Today, Argonaut is built on what's called Draft Trial for Use 2. We're going to work together on the more modern version, what's called Release 4 of the FHIR API specification. And that will include clinical notes and encounters. So in some cases, there'll be some write capability as well as the read-only, which is what we have today, fully deployed. There will be a specific emphasis on clinical subscriptions. So that idea that a physician could subscribe to his patient's ADT feeds, that will now be functionally possible using FHIR, or at least will be tested this calendar year. Adding a new provision around data provenance, who authored the piece of content, who updated it, and the like. That too will be a high priority. It's in the US core data for interoperability requirements, but not yet in the FHIR standards process. So that's a priority. And then for third-party app developers who are trying to facilitate some kind of decision support service in a, sort of as a plug-in app, if you will, what's called CDS hooks, so decision support hooks. There's now a provision to add to say, how does a third-party app not only pull from the EHR relevant information in terms of who is the patient the doctor's looking at, and might that trigger a decision support alert, but also a way of messaging back to the EHR, basic functionality. Put this in a task order, put this in a queue for signature, whatever the circumstances may be. This is the Argonaut portfolio. The Karen Alliance is working on that blue button standard for commercial health plans, real-time benefit check for consumers, a library of content around post-acute care, really trying to tackle the consumer identity in the internet age. And then last but not least, some framework for increasing the trust amongst the consumer designated apps. And then I'll leave this one as later review, but these are the key projects within the Da Vinci working group. I am personally not as active in this group, but it's very clearly focused on the key business-to-business exchange plans and provider activities. So gaps in care and some form of documentation requirements and the like. There's a final statement about a few areas that I'm interested in outside of all of what I've just covered. There is an opportunity there's a provision in the rule around opening up more information on provider directories. For those of you who remember, in 2015, healthcare.gov mandated that physicians participating in health plans, that the health plans had to disclose whether the doctor is in network or out of network. Remember that old saying, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor? Well, healthcare.gov wanted to post a feature on the website where you could type in the name of your doctor and could basically find a list, search for plans based on whether or not that doctor's in network. Well, those directories are woefully inadequate and often inaccurate. Many report from the OIG all the way through industry-led activities, directories are not complete. Certainly physician addresses are often wrong, but certainly also are whether they're accepting new patients or not for the plan that you have. So part of what I'm hoping to do at the time in 2015, I worked with Google, Microsoft, the search engines, what's called schema.org. So if a physician marked up his or her web page, like Jefferson Health in Philly has voluntarily done, with all the information about in-network, out-of-network, and the like, then they would get preferenced in the search engine results. And so one way to strengthen the integrity and quality of more timely provider directory information is to just get it right from the physician's website. And so I'll be spending a bit more time on working to get that standard more widely deployed across physician websites. And then hopefully that becomes another open data set that we can access and use to make sure people have the right information to pick the plans that are right for them and then navigate within the plan that they have This could impact surprise billing and a variety of other use cases. I will leave it at that. There is this broader question of trust and the idea of an app-based fiduciary standard, and that may be more esoteric we can cover. But I see there's a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to pull that one up. If people want to unmute and ask a question directly, you're welcome to do that. Asim, you're on. I see that you asked a question about how difficult it is to set up the integrations like Apple. One bit of good news there. It's not publicized in a way that is like press release worthy, but it's also not like a secret sauce here. But Apple has begun, because they've really built up that infrastructure, they've begun enabling health systems to self-register. So if you have a Fire server and it meets the Argonaut specifications, you can initiate a process to test with Apple and to make sure that it works. And if it works, then you can just have your site appear on the list. And so some folks on this line, right? Yeah, you want to go around?
Yeah, I was saying that's if you want to let Apple pull your records. What if your app wants to pull competitor records? Okay,
right. So, yeah, that's a great question. So if you built an app at Baylor and you wanted, you noticed that Texas Health Resources is live on an Apple app, or they've got an Epic, they're live on the open epic.com Fire endpoint, then your app should be able to register with the same level of effort as Apple, meaning you'd have to go either to the EHR vendor who's offering the registration once and available everywhere, or you'd go straight to your competitor and say, hey, I'd like to register my app. If you wanted Exhibit A on information blocking, if you suggested that you wanted to register your app at Texas Health Resources and they said no, I think you'd have like literally the most ironclad OIG complaint that will result in this $1 million fine. And so the idea that you have to register, an application needs to be registered, but ONC has made it clear that registration process may involve vetting, and there may be security vetting and testing to make sure that you're not going to misbehave, but that vetting is expected to take no more than 5 business days in the proposed rule. Other questions?
Aneesh, I have a question.
Yes, Shafiq.
In the new proposed rule that I'm reading, they're also saying that the providers will be responsible for information blocking.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, this is where it gets complicated in the sense that what is the responsibility of the vendor, the EHR vendor? What is the responsibility of Rush? And how between the two of you, behaviors to a third-party app would be construed as information blocking, and you may finger point and say it's not my fault, it's Epic's fault, and they may say the same about you. But if the net effect is that the app that's trying to communicate with you can't get in, then that would be you would be potentially a source of the complaint. So there's a lot of definition here around who's a data supplier and who's a data technology vendor. And it's really the mixture of the two that constitutes the result. On consumer app, getting back to Asim's question, if if University of Chicago wanted to register a mobile app with Rush and you said no, even though Epic had the technical ability for doing it, then you would be subject to the complaint of information blocking and potentially could be found liable. You would bear liability is the point. Okay. Will I be sharing a copy of my slides? Of course. We'll figure out the most efficient way of doing it. I assume I'll just put it on my website. That may be the easiest.
So one more question, Aneesh, one more question.
Yeah, Shafiq, go ahead. Of course.
When you are saying there is no common data set for oncology and other things, there is a line in the new rule that they say that if somebody asks for a complete medical record, we have to share the complete medical record. So what are we sharing as a complete medical record if we don't know what is a complete medical record?
Yeah, no, you're onto a very important, probably one of the most nuanced part of the rules. So today, your capacity to respond to that question hinges on the term readily producible. So if they want the complete medical record, including images that are scanned and pathology reports or information about their cancer tumor progression, which requires paper charts or some other systems, then you would go to medical records, and there's a whole process by which the consumer might pay for the fees for your staff to go gather that information and organize it, often printed, to the patient. The readily producible part ties to the issue of data standards. And so, this is going to sound wrong, and forgive me for this, but we did propose a project in the Argonaut project this year for, I affectionately called it the hashtag Get Everything, where using the FHIR document request, a command, you could pull all relevant documents that you might have, including a preoperative note and a discharge plan and a whole variety of things. And I know Ginny's on the line, and she's got a lot of content, these old CCDAs or CDA templates. I think the version R2 is the template, unstructured template. You could conceivably put all of the health information inside Rush into a set of documents that you would wrap in a R2 unstructured template that HL7 supports, and you could ship this big container and say, here, you want everything? Boom, here's the hashtag Get Everything output. It would not be discrete data standardized. It would be the blob, hopefully machine readable blob, but the blob. And so, Shafiq, you and I can definitely work on what does the hashtag Get Everything look like from Shafiq's world. The premise here is, can we get 4 or 5 health systems to say, hey, we're all going to collectively answer the hashtag Get Everything the same way, and here's the universe of documents we think we can add to that list. So that may be, and there's actually a request for comment by CMS on what document templates should be accessible when a consumer invokes the document query in FHIR.
No, I need guidance on that. Plus, I want to establish the standard by doing it first.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so door number 1 is, let's do the FHIR documents. Let's recruit others on this line who care to be a part of it and follow up and get a few of us to volunteer on that hashtag Get Everything. The second argument, though, is that there's a chance to do more discrete data elements. So also at HIMSS, and I didn't spend much time on it today, MITRE, the ASCO, which is the clinical oncologists, and the Biden Cancer Initiative had a working group specifically on discrete data elements in cancer, on tumor progression, stage, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a very active working group now for cancer data specifically to make a difference. So what I would say to you is, Ginny is giving us real-time advice. The Argonaut project has published a draft FHIR clinical notes implementation guide where we can be early adopters of that for the hashtag Get Everything, so documents and discrete notes. And then we have this cancer data piece, which could be a second. I realize I screwed up on talking too long and listening less, but I'll stick around if people have interest. Any other questions, pushback, suggestions on where you'd like me to focus, just in terms of being helpful to you?
Yeah, Aneesh, this is Prashant from Prominence. I do have one question.
Yes, Prashant.
So what I mean, this FHIR is definitely is information transmission in a decentralized way. My question goes back to when an entity and a resource goes from one location to a member can go to one plan to the next plan to come back to the same plan. So what I see a trend is the same data can get duplicated, replicated at times. So is there any movement going on? Is there any discussion going on when these resources are shared? There should be some unique identity, and when it's stored, it should be stored in a certain way. you don't see the same data 100 times.
Yeah, so you hit the nail right on the head. When Apple went live on Apple Health, what they found is that because we forgot to add the Fire encounter resource, they had a lot of this raw data sitting untethered to the context of the visit. And so we have to add the encounter resource in order to make it clear that this content ties to that encounter. And so that is work the Argonaut project is 100% committed to doing, and we'll work on this calendar year. My guess is we'll have some drafts capable for testing by mid-year or maybe September. And then on the other side, the provenance piece, that'll help you understand the data source. You might be able to understand the implications through the provenance to know where did this bit of data come from, and is it the 15th copy of the same information?
Okay.
Other questions? I'll do rapid fire response to those who had. There were a couple that tried to jump in at the same time.
Shoot.
Anyone else?
How do I get to the second level guest out
Hey, Aneesh, this is awesome.
Yes.
You hear that when Seema Verma said, I think it was on Tuesday's afternoon speech about how pricing would be included in some of these requirements for payers? Does that ring a bell?
Of course it rings a bell. It's super controversial.
Yeah, I was thinking that was transformative, but I don't know what you meant and if it's as crazy as I think it sounds.
What I would say to you is it's not in the rule as in a mandate now. It is an aspirational call to action. So she issued calls to action. So I guess the way I would characterize, and I don't want to speak for CMS, but what I would characterize it is that she has said before that she wants price, quality / outcomes information in the hands of consumers to help them make better decisions. And she can only control price as it relates to government-funded plans. But in theory, and I'll tell you again, personal bias, because I'm going to be weighing in here, not passively, but actively, is to get a bunch of health employers to attach an Appendix A to their TPA contracts, effectively demanding that net price be accessible to a consumer designated app. And so it is going to be scary for the folks who like the opacity of today's pricing model. I'm not one of those. And so this is not a done, like these rules solved everything. These are a shot across the bow about a new architecture, a modern approach, a consumer-centric approach. And the work to be done now is some of those more complicated issues, like you saw in the letter. If you saw the blog, the link I gave you, blog.hl7.com or .org, you can read the CMS letter, and in there is a very specific call out for please work on standards to disclose real-time pricing data. So it doesn't dictate how to do it. It just says do it, please.
So you're talking about effectively for right now Medicare Advantage plans.
Yeah, the scope is Medicare Advantage, qualified health plans, and Medicaid managed care. And by the way, even Medicaid fee-for-service, by the way, that one slipped under my radar, but the rules actually apply across the board to all government-funded programs, at least as to the patient access to the blue button style data. Kevin is noting, by the way, Kevin's from MedStar, you're noting that encounter resources available. Kevin, my comment generally is that every EHR vendor has their own version of their FHIR roadmap. That is their web services plan. And many are launching services in that, beyond what is minimally agreed upon as a FHIR Argonaut project open standard that has industry consensus. So when you hear me talk about the roadmap, it's not has each vendor on its own done too much or too little. It's that what have we done collectively to have a common language, so it doesn't matter you're at Cerner or at here or it's there, but rather you have to do it. The goal is to get people to have a common answer using FHIR, and then the pressure among the customer base to say, I want the Fire version. Like the most obvious example here, Kevin, is scheduling. My guess is you may be live on scheduling inside the EHR using the EHR's web services. Scheduling works. But the Fire scheduling resource is actually vendor agnostic, and in many cases can be more cost effective to the app developers. And so health systems like the Cleveland Clinic and Mount Sinai have embraced the Fire scheduling resource, which means that any third-party app can plug right in without having to go to an integration vendor. I am clearly in overtime, and I'm sure many of you have to go. But if you have questions, this is I hope this is helpful, first of all. It's number one. Number two, please reach out. I'd love to be helpful. If you are like Shafiq, motivated to work on something, please let me know, and I'll do everything that I can to connect you to the right communities of interest. And if one doesn't exist, we could work together on establishing a community of interest. And obviously, if you're angry that I'm pushing for things that you don't like, I'm always happy to hear that feedback too. I may not change my mind, but I want to hear that feedback in case I'm advocating in a manner that may be net harmful. So thank you all for the time, and I will, I'll let you all bid adieu and wish you the very best in the coming weeks. Onward, everybody. Thanks for your time today.